Yesterday, a fellow named Jack suggested on my YouTube channel that I review this newest video from Trent Horn, where he talks about the language of the savage and how Christians, he gives a definition as to how we should use the language of savagery for other cultures and ways that you can justify it. And so thank you, Jack, for making that recommendation. I watched Trent's video. I enjoyed it as I enjoy all of his videos. There were some things I agreed with and some things I definitely disagreed with in his video, as I'm going to explain now by presenting a dilemma for Trent to consider. First of all, let me just say one thing I agreed with about Trent's video. So he points out that there are these double standards. And I'm going to give you an example of the kind of double standard he's talking about from my own experience. So back when I was at Regent College doing my master's degree this is 30 years ago now, hard to believe, the philosopher who was teaching the philosophy course that I was in, he assigned a textbook on the history of philosophy. And interestingly, he had not completely read the textbook before he assigned it. And as we were reading the textbook, when the author came to talk, and I tried to look up the title of it, I couldn't find the title online, but it came out originally in the mid 1990s. And when the author was talking they included a section on marginalized peoples, and they were talking about the philosophy of the ancient Aztecs, and they were talking about how they would have these mass executions where they would sacrifice people and remove their hearts when they were still alive. And it was just absolutely horrifying. But the way that they described it, they talked about it in very noble, almost admirable terms as this really elevated philosophy of blood and soil and the connection to the earth and the land and the sun and all of this stuff. And eventually the professor got increasingly embarrassed as we were reading the text, and he had to apologize that he had not entirely reviewed the text before assigning it. And yeah, we were all kind of shocked by the way that the author was trying to justify the heinous, savage practices of the ancient Aztecs. So those are some of the things that Trent is pointing out, is that there are aspects of cultures that you could rightly consider to be immoral and in that sense savage, and you shouldn't apologize for condemning them. He gives another example, which is more contemporary, the practice of widow burning or sati in Indian society, and how we shouldn't apologize that the British colonial empire, which was also ostensibly Christian, and while it obviously had all sorts of moral flaws, nonetheless was morally noble in eliminating sati, or this practice of burning widows alive on the pyres, the funeral pyres of their dead husbands. So Trent's basic claim is we can use the idea of describing a culture as savage to the extent or degree to which it is not aligning with the teachings of Christ, something along those lines. And in that sense, he also would recognize that to some degree we all have savagery within us, right? We're all sinful, fallen people, but to that degree we can use that language of savagery to identify things that are immoral, inconsistent with the life and teaching of Christ, and thus we should seek to reform different cultures without apology to the extent that they are failing to be like Christ. And in that sense, you can talk about cultures as savage if they are very far away from the life and teaching of Christ. Great. I'm kind of sympathetic with all of that. But I think that there's a big problem here that Trent is not really wrestling with. He could be, as we say, hoist on his own petard. So let me talk a little bit about that. First of all, imagine a culture in which they practiced abortion. And I start with that because, of course, there's nothing that conservative Christians probably talk about more these days as a moral issue than abortion. So imagine a culture that practiced abortion. They also practiced punitive hand amputation. In particular, they would punish women who engaged in certain actions by cutting off their hands. Now, you'd be thinking first of all, I regularly hear Christian conservatives talk about abortion as like child sacrifice. So the evils of abortion today are the evils of child sacrifice. And then they talk about punitive hand amputation. That would be like some barbaric Muslim Middle Eastern culture, right? What about that culture also slaughtering men, women, and children, non-combatants, indiscriminately? What about that culture targeting specifically infants and slaughtering infants? What if that culture also would slaughter entire families and kidnap virgin girls for their army? What if that culture also would execute rape victims or people who were potentially rape victims by stoning them to death, pelting them to death with rocks? What if that culture accepted dismembering corpses and displaying severed heads? Add all of that up. Would a culture that was doing all of this qualify as savage by Trent Horn's measure? Would he advocate calling a culture today that did all these things savagery? Well, I definitely think he would. Why not? I don't think the Aztecs are worse than what I have described here. This is heinous. This is immoral. This is savagery by Trent Horn's definition. So we should call this culture savage. And Trent Horn, in the video, he's very intentional about pushing back against moral relativists who would say, well, you can say something was bad in one culture, but not in another. So you could say, today it's bad to rip the hearts out of the chests of living people, but not at the time of the Aztecs. Trent very strongly condemns moral relativism. And I agree. Good. Let's condemn moral relativism. So all of these things, if you see them in a culture, whether today or whether in the ancient past, you would rightly call that culture savage by Trent Horn's definition. Okay, now let's turn to the Bible. Abortion, the trial of the bitter waters. Now, this is too long for me to review the entire passage. I'm just going to commend it to you for your research. Go to Numbers 5, 11 to 31, and read what the Torah advocates for a man who suspects his wife of infidelity, and how there is a very detailed trial to which she should be subjected if she is suspected by her husband of infidelity, which includes undertaking a practice that would induce a miscarriage or an abortion if she is pregnant due to infidelity. And set aside for reading's sake, for your focus, set aside how disturbing it is that you could just have a husband who's very jealous, who torments his wife by subjecting her to this very traumatic situation and public humiliation. Set that part aside and just focus on the fact that there's an attempt to induce abortion in the case of fetuses that are the result of impregnation through adultery. So that's abortion. Punitive hand amputation. Now, the other passages are more brief, so we're going to read them. So if two men are fighting and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant, and she reaches out and seizes him by his private parts, or as we say more specifically, his junk, you shall cut off her hand. Show her no pity. So amputate her hand. Cut it right off. Slaughtering men, women, and children, Deuteronomy 20:17, completely destroy them, these people groups, as the Lord has commanded you. And of course, we know Joshua then is described as doing just that, going into the land, starting off at the city of Jericho, and killing, as we read in Joshua 6:21, men and women, young and old. Killing infants specifically. 1 Samuel 15 specifies of the Amalekites that Saul is to kill them all. Kill the men, kill the women, kill the children, and kill the infants. Now, kidnapping girls and killing off their families. Kill all the boys. This is talking about the Midianites. Moses is commanding them to kill all the boys. Kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Okay, so what we have here is girls, maybe 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old girls who are virgins, who have just witnessed their entire family slaughtered in front of them, are now being seized by the army and married off to soldiers, given away to soldiers in the army. And just ask yourself, when we talk about something called consent, for a person to consent, they must be able to consent to sexual contact. The consent must be enthusiastic and it must be ongoing throughout the encounter. Legally, those are the three criteria that are required for consent. And if you don't have those, then what has happened in the sexual encounter is an assault/rape. and a girl who just witnessed her entire family slaughtered and has now been married off and given 30 days to mourn. That's something to keep in mind here, which is not specifically here, but which is part of the broader scope. She's given 30 days to mourn her family and then is taken by one of the soldiers who slaughtered her family. Can she meaningfully consent to sexual contact? This 15-year-old girl, can she meaningfully consent to sexual contact with the 30-year-old soldier who just slaughtered her family in front of her? And if not, what you have here is a recipe for institutionalized rape of kidnapped victims. Okay, what about executing rape victims by stoning? Now, this may not be obviously what you read here. Let me explain it to you. In Deuteronomy 22, we read this. If a man happens to meet in a town with a virgin pledged to be married and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man, because he violated another man's wife. So, first thing here is you might think, ask yourself this. Just talk about the stoning piece. I don't know if you've ever witnessed a stoning. I always commend to people, if you want to get an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about stoning, watch the film The Stoning of Soraya M., which reenacts a modern day stoning that happened in rural Iran in the early 1980s when a woman was buried up to her waist by her husband who wanted to divorce her. And then the villagers pelted her to death with rocks because she was accused falsely of adultery. And you watch this horrifying scene. It is tough to imagine a more barbaric way to kill somebody. Even if you think capital punishment is morally justified, there is no moral justification for killing somebody by pelting them to death with rocks over, a 45-minute period, however long it takes for them to lose consciousness. Absolutely evil. That is what is described here. That adulterers should be subjected to being pelted to death with rocks. Now, the next point is the main point. What we have here is a man takes a woman and has sex with her. And if she doesn't scream out while he is having sex with her, she is considered complicit and she should be pelted to death with rocks, just like the man. Here's the problem. It looks like the author of Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 to 24, is unfamiliar with what we call tonic immobility. What that refers to is what we colloquially refer to as the freeze response. In extreme emotional trauma, threat, and danger, people, sometimes the response is that they shut down, they freeze. They lose the ability to speak. Sometimes they become unconscious or physically immobilized, unable to move. Sometimes they have an experience of being disembodied. Those are all trauma responses to respond to something like a sexual assault. And so what you have described in Deuteronomy 22, where a man takes a woman and has sex with her and she doesn't cry out, that is consistent with the tonic immobility response of a woman who was raped. And what this passage prescribes for that woman who very possibly was raped, not a willing complicit party, but rather who was raped, is that she should be pelted to death with rocks. Executing a rape victim by stoning. Dismembering corpses. Well, in all the previous passages I've been citing, I've just used the NIV. Here I'm going to use the NASB because sometimes the NIV does these little tricks. It tries to cover up what is actually in the text and make it a little more palatable for a mainstream evangelical audience. In 1 Samuel 15:33, it just describes Samuel as killing King Agag. But the NASB is a more literal translation and gives you the actual Hebrew. It says that Samuel cut Agag to pieces before the Lord. He dismembered him. So what you have is not only killing people, but dismembering them. And in fact, the dismemberment here is suggestive of a human sacrifice. So the idea of just as you dismember the corpse of the ox or the sheep or the goat, you're dismembering the human body before God as a sacrifice to him. And then displaying severed heads. I mean, could there be a more visceral illustration of what we would call a savage culture? than people who took severed heads and showed them around as trophies. Horrifying, evil. You right away think of it, ISIS, right? You think about ISIS displaying severed heads on pikes, that kind of thing. Well, David defeated Goliath and he right away amputated his head and then treated it as a trophy. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. Now you can say, oh, but this isn't saying behead people and use them as trophies. It's just description. It's not normative endorsement. Come on, bud. What we have in 1 Samuel 15, 1754 is a neutral, non-moral description of what David did. There's no sense in the text that this is problematic in any way. It is describing indeed the normative standards assumed in the culture, that there was nothing morally problematic about amputating people's heads and then displaying those severed heads as trophies. That is the culture. Here, then, to conclude, is the problem for Trent Horn. He seems to have the very same double standards that he would give to other people. So in his video, he plays a clip of this enlightened academic who's defending the savagery of the Aztecs and suggesting it's not really as barbaric as we are told. There is a nice way to spin it and make it look almost noble. He's got the same problem here. This is Trent's dilemma. Either he is consistent with his repudiation of moral relativism, and he says by his measure and standard, ancient Israelite culture was savage. These were savages. They were in need of the gospel. They were contrary, opposed to the gospel in this barbaric, blood-soaked culture. Or he follows the way of this person he critiques on the Aztecs, and he develops a double standard and tries to rationalize and justify the actions of the ancient Israelites that we read in the Bible. So that is Trent Horn's dilemma. I look forward to hearing his response, what he might think about that. Of course, if you want to read more about how to think about all of these issues, as always, check out my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, which I've linked below.